Madam President, we have been stuck for some time now on having a appropriations bill that meets the disasters that have occurred recently in Missouri and before that in the Carolinas and Georgia and other places. I want to continue to work hard to get that done, but I want to talk a little bit about the effects of what's happened in the state of Missouri as part of what's happened with floods this spring. We have seen catastrophic and in some cases historic flooding, both on the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers over the last couple of months. Along the Missouri, there was this unusual thing that I'd actually never heard the term before, a bomb cyclone, a wind event that also produces lots of rain in Nebraska on the northern plains on frozen ground. All of that water had no place to run except off, and it was the equivalent of 8 inches of rain in a place that we usually don't get water from. There have been significant rain the last few days of March. That created another flood. And on the Mississippi, we've seen significant rains there that while they haven't set a record, they've certainly consistently got the Mississippi standards in the 7th highest level, flood level that river has ever been in from some of the locks. There are locks north of St. Louis. You can navigate the river without locks south of St. Louis, but in the area from the Canton Lock Dam to the Winfield Lock and Dam on the Mississippi, there are significant problems waiting to happen over the next few weeks. After the rains have occurred in northwest Missouri and in Iowa and Nebraska and our state in Kansas, many of the water is still there. The floods have stayed up so high for so long that it's difficult to really evaluate the damage that's been done, unlike a tornado, which we have some familiarity with, where you can go in quickly and evaluate what happened. You can't do that nearly as quickly with a flood. We do know that there's been at least $25 million in damages to public infrastructure. Many cost emergency measures have experienced costs statewide. There's been 215 road closures statewide. 46 roads continue to be closed as late as the 3rd week in April. Interstate 29 north of St. Joseph's been closed since March and is expected to stay closed probably until June. Not obviously a very disruptive set of circumstances for people who would normally use those roads and bridges all the time. One of the major Class 1 railways has been damaged. That railway was just raised in 2011 to deal with a flood in 2011. An ethanol plant was knocked out of line, offline. Electric substations have been damaged. Grain stored in bins from last year's harvest have been destroyed. Livestock lost. Many farmers won't be able to get to the ground to plant their crops this year. It will be too wet once the water goes down until it's too late to successfully plant a crop. And so thousands of acres and hundreds of farms just simply won't be able to do what they do because of the flood. The scale and scope of these events has clearly overwhelmed local governments, overwhelmed county governments, stretched the state government in a significant way, but most effectively and most importantly, it's impacted families and individuals. If your home is underwater, if it takes 2 more hours to get to school, if you have no chance of planting your crop, or if you're in a business that relates to the family that's going to plant the crop, if you have nobody buying the seed, buying the repairs for their equipment, paying for the gas, doing the gasoline, the things that you do to keep in business, that has all kinds of impact as well. The governor of Missouri has requested a presidential disaster declaration. I'm certainly for that, and every member of the Missouri delegation signed a letter asking the president to grant that declaration. The assistance that would be impacted by this will be vital. It's important. We need that kind of assistance now. And I'm going to continue to work, and I hope all our colleagues continue to work to make this year's disasters and last fall's disasters eligible for the funds that we appropriate for disaster coverage. During the flood, a lot has been said about the Corps of Engineers' management of the river, and if anything they could have done might have prevented the flood this time. I think probably not. You know, this is such an unusual flood that the locks on the Missouri were north of where the flood really occurs. There was a dam that broke that would not normally have broke, that would normally not even be part of the Missouri River Management System. And so the Corps has been out there trying to help figure out how to recover rather than causing this particular flood. And in fact, the Corps and the permanent staff in places like the Kansas City office of the Corps understand the Missouri River better than anybody, in my view, and are helpful when they can be. But that doesn't mean that the Corps, in a greater sense, isn't responsible for what has become the new normal on the Missouri River. We have had recurrent historic flooding on the river now for 15 years. Ever since the Corps asked for a new management plan in 2004 and got the new management plan, it just simply doesn't work. At least 6 of the top 10 river crests in recorded history have occurred in the last 15 years. Floods in 2007, 2008, 2009, 2011. You've seen a pattern here, Madam President. 2013 and 19. The only reason we didn't have dramatic floods every year was we had a couple of drought years in there in 2009 and 12. And this all goes back to that 2004 management plan. So what changed in 2004? In 2004, the Corps started to implement the Missouri River Recovery Program in response to a biological opinion. Opinions may be the key word here. A biological opinion from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that took the position that the existing management of the river was impacting one species of fish, and 2 species of birds. Now, the ultimate result was prioritizing the management of the entire river to benefit that fish and those birds. It was above flood control. It was above navigation. It didn't consider what was detrimental to families, to farms, or the local infrastructure, and was not necessary. Saving wildlife is a worthy goal, but that goal to truly be worthy has to also include how it impacts families, how it impacts people, and how it impacts the economy. You know, we've had management plans on the Mississippi River as well, but they have never been allowed to become, the wildlife management plans didn't become the plan that substituted for all other plans. The Corps management plan brought about changes in the lower river. There are 6 locks, and there are 6 dams rather, and reservoirs above the lower Missouri that starts roughly in the place where Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa and Missouri all come together. What happened was the system, they began to destabilize the banks, to construct pallid surgeon chutes that impacted how the water ran into the river, to no longer dredge the river like they had before. And by the way, just to understand why that matters, a 9-foot channel of a river carries a lot more water than a 6 or 7-foot channel of the river. If you're channeling the river so you can still navigate the river, they had interception rearing complexes, none of which appears to have really made much of a difference, except they made it hard to control the river at flood stage. Modifying, eliminating the river control systems, eliminating the normal things in the river, the revenants, the wing dikes, the chevrons that control the river and send the water the direction it needs to be for flood protection, and that just didn't happen. The Fish and Wildlife and Corps engineers actually now know that some of the actions they were taking out caused direct negative impacts on the river and didn't do any good. There's a high level of certainty that when you notch a dike in the river, it's essentially, it means you cut a hole in a structure that's designed to channel the water. When you do that, bad things happen. That's why that structure was put there in the first place for a reason. And one of the most disappointing parts of what happened is a relatively low level of certainty that any of these things do any good. In fact, the Corps and the Fish and Wildlife people have already abandoned the pursuit of what they constructed as pallid surgeon chutes, which they thought would encourage the pallid surgeon to multiply. By the way, this is a fish that we happen to multiply ourselves at the Neosho Fish Hatchery. I believe the oldest fish hatchery in the United States hatchery system is at Neosho. Pallid surgeon is one of the things that they do. And they didn't work, but they did encourage more flood risk. I would have here one suggestion for the Corps. If you know an action will increase flood control and you don't know whether and you know it will harm people and harm property and you don't know whether it will help save a species, don't do it. There has to be a way you figure out first that this is going to work, and then you might evaluate, is it so important that we're going to impact people and property? But what we've had is a big experiment that it turned out was the wrong thing to do to start with. It didn't serve the purpose, and it did harm the river and people who live on the river. Flood control and navigation needs to be once again be relegated to the top two priorities, elevated to the top two priorities of managing the river. I look forward to working with my colleagues to figure out how to do this in a better way. There is no question, Mr. President, that the Mississippi River is about to be more important than it's been in 100 years. There's also no reason that the Missouri River, as an avenue of commerce, as an avenue that people can enjoy and get near and enjoy from a tourist and travel perspective, is there. But there's no reason it can't continue to be managed in a way that benefit families, that benefit us economically, and don't repeat year after year after year of flooding that did not occur under the original management plan. We need to look at that. We need to have a management plan that meets the common sense standard. The current plan does not. We've had now 15 years to prove that the current plan does not, and I'm going to be working hard with both the Corps, the Department of Interior, and Fish and Wildlife to see if we can't have a plan that meets that common sense standard.